and I'm from a local Boston Rails consultancy called ThoughtBot. We're just downtown, small group of people. About 6 months ago, we developed something called the Shoulda testing framework. Our spec was pretty new when that was made, and we, well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. So Shoulda is assessing framework. It's a lot like our spec. It makes things very easy to write tests very quickly, makes them very readable. So the first question I get asked by everybody who I talk to about Shoulda is, why not our spec? So I'm going to get that out of the way real quick, okay? Now, first of all, when we looked at our spec, like I said, this was 6 months ago. Our spec has made a lot of improvements since then. Still, a lot of the arguments that I have remain. The first one is that it's still incompatible with test unit. From going to the Ruby conference over last weekend or the weekend before, they said that they are going to try and address this, where they're going to try and rewrite the inside of our spec to make it work on top of test unit. But at the time, especially, we needed a test suite that required no retooling in our support applications. I wanted to be able to run cruise control with my application and not have to filter it through some sort of other script to see if the RSpec things also passed. Namespace pollution. This is my problem with RSpec, with test spec, with simply BDD, is that they pollute the namespace. So I just looked at the RSpec docs, and it still has should not, context, describe, and respond to, all defined upon the Ruby core classes. So I don't know what happens if I'm testing an object that has context on it, and I don't want to find out. I didn't like the syntax, and actually most people I talked to also didn't like the syntax, where you have your object and then it added the should methods onto that. I think actually the syntax error. I think that should be should space phrase error exception. But nonetheless, it's it just seemed kind of counterintuitive. I didn't understand why we needed to learn a new assertion syntax when the assert equals and all of those helpers are already there and are perfectly readable to me. And it promotes the dreaded overmocking, which we're going to talk about now. Now there's two arguments in testing. There's almost like two warring factions. One that leans way too far into the mocking area, and one that leans way too far into the non-mocking area. There's trade-offs to both of these. My problems with mocking is that it can lead to brittle tests. You can change the way your application works correctly, but because you've been mocking things, you're making assumptions about the implementation inside your tests, right? And so your tests can fail, even though you've refactored correctly. It can also lead to a false sense of security on the other side of things, which is that you can put whatever you want as an expectation in your tests. And as long as your code does it, your tests are going to pass. But then what are you testing? You're testing that you called that exactly the way you said your tests say you're supposed to call that. So what I want to make clear here is this is about over-mocking. This is about overzealous use of mocking by people who haven't thought as hard as they need to about what exactly it is that they're testing. So I found that a lot of the BDD examples that came with our spec showed situations where this was going to happen. So, like where I work, like I said, it's a small company. We've got about 12 people right now. And I'd say about half of them are heavy into mocking and half of them are heavy into non-mocking. But both sides have figured out that you can't go too far to the extreme or you'll also hit problems like this. So I just want to get that out of the way. This is why Shoulda exists alongside our spec. So what is Shoulda? Well, Shoulda is a Rails plugin that's fully compatible with test unit. And it comes with extra assertions, the should and context macros, a bunch of Rails-specific macros, including active record and action controller helpers. And let me tell you, The should and context macros, as anybody who's written RSpec tests will tell you, those are a lifesaver right there. When you get into actual domain-specific test macros, those just incredibly increase your, or decrease your development time and increase your test coverage. Very few lines of code. So this is a should statement. This is very simple. This is a normal test unit test. You're inside the test unit class. So we're not defining stuff on object and kernel. We're just doing it inside a normal test unit class. Here I've got a regular test. Test should be true, insert true. And below it I've got a should statement, which is just should be true. This will create the test, test colon, should space be space true. Spaces, colons, all that stuff. Perfectly valid in your method names. Nothing is. The only thing that matters with test unit is that your method name starts with the word test. These are your contexts. So I immediately wanted to write this to support nested contexts, and it's incredibly useful. So this is kind of a contrived example of a queue test. So the outer context is a queue instance, and it's got a setup block. So that's going to run first. And then you've got the should respond to push method. So in your test, you'll create a new queue, and it'll assert that it responds to push. Then you've got a nested context with a single element. And inside there, you've got another setup block and another test. These context setup blocks get chained. So this inner test here will first create a new queue, then it'll push, the symbol something into the queue, and then it'll assert that something's returned by pop. So the use of these nested contexts are wonderful because you can get away from things like fixtures, which pretty much everybody now has agreed there's something wrong with Rails fixtures when you're developing a large application. They're way too brittle. With this, you can set up a user in the topmost context, give it some postings in an inner context, mark half of the postings as published in a context inside of that. And each time, you know exactly what test should be tested inside that context. And the test names are created from all the strings. So this last test here is named a queue instance with a single element should return that element on pop. So when you've got an error, it's just incredibly legible, and it's very easy to see what went wrong. Now, like I said, the nested contexts and the should statements, they make it real easy to write your tests and real easy to make them as dry as possible. And so using that stuff, you can create all kinds of macros. These are some of the macros that come with the Shoulda plugin. Load all fixtures is just a helper. It's the way that we usually do development. We have one fixture file for each model, and you've got one entry inside each fixture file. This is pretty much just so you can do user find first and know you've got a valid user, even if you don't care about what that user really has attached. Did you have a question about that?
No, just noting that a similar trick also lets you work around some of the problems that you have with having foreign key constraints in the database if you start applying.
Yeah, Rails 2.0 is going to come out with Foxy fixtures, I think. Isn't that correct? So you'll actually be able to specify fixtures without using IDs. You can actually refer to other fixtures. So like I was saying, everybody recognizes the fact that fixtures right now are kind of broken, and everybody's working to fix them in some manner. We're mostly just trying to get away from it. And that's what we're using the nested context for. So for this example, we have a bunch of macros that create, multiple tests each. So should require attributes, name and phone number. That'll create a test that, instantiates a new active record model. It'll figure out that it's a user model from the name of the test that you're in. It'll call whether or not it's valid, and it'll test to make sure that the correct error is set on that attribute in the user model. And we've got a lot of these things. And this was actually one of the first reasons we wrote Shoulda, was because we were thinking to ourselves, if they can make validations so simple to write, we should be able to make the tests for validations equally as simple. And when you do things like this with test-driven development, it just clicks. So now I'm fully TDD after I was able to, after I wrote this library. And when I'm creating a new model or class, this is the first stuff that I would write out. And then I watch my test fail, and I chuckle to myself. And then I write about the same amount of code, and I get passing tests. So we've got, should require attributes, should require unique attributes. We've got a couple of tests for what are valid values and not valid values. Some protected attributes. The associations has one, had many through. All those are supported. These are the tests that are created. Like I said, spaces, strange characters, all that kind of stuff. That's actually perfectly valid in a Ruby test name, or in a Ruby method name in general. And when you're writing tests, using that kind of stuff really increases the legibility of your error output. So in other words, if you got a failing test, you can read that like a sentence, and you understand from a domain point of view what's going on. Now we have the same kind of macros for controllers as well. So I've set up a context on get to show, and in the setup I'm getting the show action for the first record. And I'm saying it should assign to user, it should respond with success, it should render template show, it shouldn't set the flash to anything. And whatever other tests you want to put inside there. On post to create, should assign to user, should redirect to, and give the path. Should set the flash to, and I can pass in a regex for what the flash should contain. I will say that writing the active record macros is a lot more straightforward than trying to figure out the right syntax for doing the controller macros. This, to me, is good, but this isn't small enough. This isn't dry enough. There's a lot of repetitive stuff, and with controllers especially, your test files end up being much larger because you've got different user contexts, different security contexts, and things to get to test against. A lot of repeated code. And we were finding that more and more, since we're a consultancy, the applications we were writing were new ones almost every month. So we were writing a lot more RESTful applications, and we were fully going, only REST for larger applications. So we were able to look at what a RESTful controller should do, a Rails RESTful controller. If you're following all the guidelines, what should it do? And we were able to condense these tests into one big macro that we call should be RESTful. Now this is pretty much the smallest incantation of should be RESTful you can get. But I do have test files that this is all I need. Because it's pretty much scaffold generated code. I just need a resource. Maybe I'll surround it in some before filters to check security. But that's wrapped around these. But as far as the actual what the controller does, it's pretty normal for Rails. So should be RESTful figures everything out. It's like Rails in that we do conventional configuration. Here's a sample of some of the tests that one statement produces. I think at last count it produced 50-something odd tests, testing all the different actions in your controller, testing whether or not you assign user objects, set the flash, render the show template. If you're doing edit, it checks to see that you have an edit form there. It also checks the different formats. So right now it does HTML and XML. Soon we want to do JSON and maybe JavaScript. Well, that one's a little tricky. It's not really a standard for JavaScript, right? But so this way, you can, because people who generate these RESTful controllers, and they leave in the response to block, because why not? It's free code. And it was written by Rails. So you're not really worried about there being bugs in the response to block. But at the same time, I'm not going to spend time writing tests for it. I don't even need it in my application, right? So if you're doing that, that's obviously horrible coding practice, right? If it's not supposed to be there, rip it out. If it is supposed to be there, you need tests for it. And so Should Be RESTful tries to cover those holes. Now, Should Be RESTful is fairly configurable. Like I said, it tries to grab the defaults, but if you need to change things, usually it can handle it. If you need to change things beyond what it can handle, chances are your controller isn't so much RESTful, it's just kind of a mixture of the two, and it's not really its domain. You go back to the context blocks and the should blocks, and you're still fine. Once again, it looks at the name of the class that it's defined in to figure out what the resource is, the model that it's working on. It uses that and pretty much that to figure out almost all the rest of the stuff. There are some things that it can't know, such as parent. If you're doing nested controllers, there's no way for it to know. I wish there was, and actually, I might try and suggest that, but there is no way for it to know right now. So if you've got it nested, you have to specify the parents. These are all the actions that it's going to test. You can tell it that you only want to test a subset of those actions, if you want. These are the formats that it supports right now. Like I said, we're going to be adding more HTML and XML. Can you guys read that, by the way? The font looks pretty small for me even over here. I'm sorry about that. Basically, though, there's this one big do block, and it's essentially a builder for a bunch of smaller tests. You're specifying your redirects here, which again, it's just using the conventions for default. And then also the flashes, which again is using the conventions for default. So, future directions for Shoulda. Well, the first thing is that when we first made this, it was just for internal use. I wanted to make it as easy to start using as possible. So, and also, I really don't know a whole lot about making gems, so I made it into a plugin. But looking at it now, and actually in talk on the mailing list for Shoulda, is saying that there's a lot of people who would like to be able to use this strictly in a Ruby application, not in a Rails application. So we're talking about splitting it up into two. There are still some edge cases where it doesn't match all the active record functionality. I would like Shoulda to be able to do pretty much anything active record can do in those one-line macro statements. JSON support for Should Be RESTful. JavaScript support would also be good. The problem with these is that there's not a lot of standards for this. With XML, it's a pretty good standard. With JSON, I think it's coming along. And by standard, I mean standard in the eyes of DHH, right? And make sure that it works fine with Rails 2.0. Right now, it's got inside of it a cert difference, one of the 6 different implementations that have been floating around the internet. And DHH decided to write his own, which is completely different, right? And finally, we're getting a Lighthouse bug tracker because we're getting a lot more traffic on the mailing list, and people are finding small issues that they want to change. So actually, the talk was pretty short, but I figured there probably would be a good number of questions. Please don't disappoint me on that. If you need more info other than asking me, we've got a project page for it up at the top. There's a Google group for it. We've got full RDocs, pretty good RDocs. And you can send any patches, questions, or suggestions to the Google group. And the slides are up online, so you can just find them on there. And lastly, I'd just like to say thanks for ThoughtBot, because they do allow us to work on these kinds of projects. They understand it brings value back to the company and all that, but for us, it means we get to work on those rules. Thank you. 10 out of my 30 minutes, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, you can take questions if.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions?
So you built this on top of test unit, basically.
That's right.
Could you build it on top of RSpec too, or is that something like it would be pretty easy to switch between the two? Like, I mean, not easy to implement, but
We
I
actually,
mean, it's basically a system that you could put on top of RSpec also. I think.
yeah, we actually first tried to build this on top of RSpec. There's two things that hit us. And one is because of the weird way that RSpec is, or was 6 months ago, the weird way that RSpec was done in the back end, it was really hard to extend things on top of it. To write these macros that we have for active record and such, kind of required more namespace pollution, you know? The second thing is RSpec did not, and I don't think does, support nested contexts. So
Yeah, that's a really major thing. I like that you added that.
It is a major thing, and it's something that, like, there was a lot of, still is, a lot of controversy in the RSpec group about. RSpec now has something called shared behaviors, which I saw presented at the Ruby conference. And those look pretty cool, but still not as easy to understand and easy to use as shared contexts.
What's the usage of this like, and what's the community around it so far?
The community is still pretty small. I'd say there's probably 100 people who use it. We're using it in, at last count, about 5 production applications. I have found that when you use something like this, probably anything other than test unit, your test coverage just seriously goes up. So those applications that we're using it in are much better tested, much better test coverage than the other applications. Part of that's because of user contexts with controllers. We figured out that most of our applications, we've got 4 different user contexts. You've got the public user who's not logged in, some dude who's logged in and looking at somebody else's stuff, the owner of stuff that's logged in, and the administrator that's logged in. Before we had an easy way to write controller tests, you pretty much did not test every action with every different set of parameters for every different user context, right? This is way too much code to write. I mean, that would actually slow you down to the point of test-driven development not being worth it at that point. But we wrote, you know, some stuff for the public user, some stuff for a logged-in user, But when you do start covering all those bases, since you're still inside a Rails functional test, you're also covering like all those whiny nils in your views, which normally wouldn't be caught, where you're assuming that the person's logged in, but they're not really. You're assuming they're an administrator at this point, but they're not really. So, I mean, back to your question, the user base is not huge right now. It is kind of growing now that I've got the Google group going, and I was actually flattered to see that there was a lot of people at the conference that I went to who were using it. But it is growing.
Is there a dry way in your Shoulda to have many contexts have the same behavior?
Well, context can be nested. So, like the master context above them all can set certain things up. But as far as like repeating a context in multiple places, is essentially what you're asking for?
Okay. I want to say like this kind of user, that kind of user, this kind of user, all should fail.
Yeah. Not natively, but for almost every application I've written that in like the test hub or RDB, and it was pretty short. Using should be RESTful can also detect permission denied. There's a couple of extra parameters where you can say for these actions they should be denied, which means they should go to a certain, they should be redirected to a certain spot, and they should have a certain flash set. So if you use something like that, yeah, you can really condense down that a public user should not see any of these.
One other question about, did you say that you use the context to set up data, testing data, and pretty much forgo fixtures?
For the most part.
Can you just tell a little more about how you use that in practice and what you found?
Sure. Well, for the most part, we don't use fixtures. The things that we've stopped doing is pretty much relying on any of the values in a fixture file. We have one record per fixture file that is valid. That's about it. We do that only for convenience so that we can do user find first and get a valid user. We don't rely upon the associations between fixtures. We don't rely upon how old this record is or anything like that. Beyond that, we use the context to the master context might create a new user. If it's like a friendship system, like the first context would be a user. Second context that's nested inside of it would be with two friends, where you create two other users to make them friends of the first user. And then a nested context inside of that would be who are also friends of each other. So you take those two users and you associate them as friends, right? And so at each stage, you've got 3 levels of context, which, if you've been looking at, for example, the fixture scenarios plugin, where you can have a different directory full of fixtures, one scenario being a family of 10 people, one scenario being the lonely guy, right? With these nested contexts, those 3 contexts have just set up 3 different scenarios that you can put your tests inside of without having to still maintain these YAML files on the side. You see what I'm saying? Another thing that we've really been looking at is the use of factories to create this stuff. I've been trying it on one application. I found that it works fairly well. I really think that there's a lot of opportunity to make it more clean. I think mostly with adder protected stuff. We use adder protected fairly liberally, and so you can't just like pass in some params and merge to create a new object and that's your factory. You have to be a little bit more clever and know what you have to actually explicitly say. But anyway, so that's pretty much how we use fixtures in these context forms. Is that what you're looking for? Anybody else? All right, well, thank you very much.
So up next is PCO, Theron Collins going to talk. And also Luke Crawford, just wanted to take an announcement.
Yeah, a quick announcement. I guess it used to happen in the past, but lately there haven't been any Ruby hack nights. So I'm going to start that up again. It'll be on the 4th Tuesdays of the week, the month. So 2 Tuesdays from now. And at first, I'm going to do it just really small at my apartment. I can have space for about 8 people. So I'll be posting on the mailing list of the blogs and info about that.